Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome the staff on to say hello and just kind of wave and say thank you to the staff. I'd like to introduce Professor Kolesas and Professor Thompson as well. Professor Kolesas has put together a nice lecture for us, or a conversation with Professor Thompson, and they're welcome to start.
Oh, there we go. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Derek, for the introduction. I'm waiting for Professor Richard Thompson Ford to be able to turn on the video.
There.
Oh, there you are. Welcome into a new era. We can finally breathe a little bit after the inauguration. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm speaking for many, I assume. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Thompson Ford. You've read the bio. He's the George Osborne Professor of Law at Stanford University, served as a commissioner of the San Francisco Housing Authority, worked as a policy consultant in different cities, writes for academic and non-academic venues. He's written many books. Impossible to do justice to the list. We're going to try to speak about 3 of his books today. But more than anything else, his well-versedness not only involved different disciplines and fields, like obviously, law, critical race theory, history, sociology, and policy, but he's an acute cultural and political observer who takes the difficult work of parsing through and acknowledging both ambiguities and being crystal clear about the relevant descriptions. He looks at the practical and the purpose, and also takes many times many unpopular views, right, that aim at provoking, the very needed connotations. He also cares about substance and style, so I really encourage you, not only in the way he dresses. He has been selected as one of the 25, right, best well-dressed man by Esquire. I can never pronounce that correctly.
That's right, yes.
Substance and style, not only in dressing, but also in the way he writes. The English is exquisite, the language really adds to the substance. So it's a pleasure for me to have you here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
So the idea for today is to discuss, the main point of your books, the race card, Rights Gone Wrong, and to introduce your new book coming out in February, Dress Code. So let me start, by a question, about your books, your arguments developed, in race card. We talk a lot about race, and this year has been particularly talkative about the issue. But sometimes talking about race is not really addressing racial injustices, right? And as they say in English, moving the needle. So in this not moving the needle, we're all familiar with the expression race card. It took me a while, I have to say, to just, when I came here, like, what are you talking about? So what are you talking about when you talk about, the race card? You said many different things, like it's a symptom of a crisis of partial success, that it occludes the ideological conflicts, that is used and abused.
Yes. Well, the shortest way to put it is, when someone says that a person's playing the race card, they mean that they're using an accusation of racism or the problem of race, kind of strategically or tactically, in order to get some probably unearned advantage. And usually this is something that's said by people on the ideological right, against, let's say, racial justice advocates, or people of color who are complaining about racism. But my claim in the book is that now it's become pervasive, so that everyone's doing this whether left, right, or center. So an example in that respect would be when now Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Clarence Thomas was nominated for his position way back in the 1990s, and you might remember that Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. And he was accused of pretty heinous instances of sex harassment by Anita Hill, who worked with him at the EEOC at the time. And he, one could make the argument, played the race card. Instead of addressing the accusations, said this was a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks who dared to question the political orthodoxy. So I started the book with that example just to show that it's not just left and right, that this is now something that a lot of people are doing. And sometimes it's a real problem and distracts our attention from the real issues of racial injustice that our society confronts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and following up on that, can you tease out the arguments that you develop in the book? I mean, why that was also using a race card? I mean, I think it's very relevant to what we're living today in terms of the Republicans, the Democrats focusing on the demographics and the skin color as opposed to wider issues.
Yes, well, I think one thing I want to say right up front is that to say that sometimes people, quote unquote, play the race card, I don't mean to say at all that racism isn't a serious problem in our society. It is. It's an enormous problem, and it's quite pervasive. There are two aspects of the using the race card that are a problem, though, I think. One is, sometimes people just do it tactically and cynically in order to get an advantage because they know that this is something that will work to shut down discussion. That's illegitimate. And again, whether left or right. The other issue, and this is the one I really want to focus on, is that very often the accusation of racism focuses on some discrete bad actor. So the issue is, this person was a racist and or biased in some other way, because it's of course other social categories that people use similar tactics. I talk about that in the book too. But this person is a racist, and by saying that, in a sense, one has narrowed the focus to just that one individual. Let's take police violence. The problem of the past year, provoking the Black Lives Matter movement. One way of looking at the problem of police violence is that there's one police officer who is a racist, who attacks a Black person because of his bad attitudes, and we need to go after that person, that we want to root out racism in the police force. Another way of looking at it, and I think the better way of looking at it, is to say, we have a structural and institutional problem in our society with the way law enforcement is done, and the way it impacts poor people, disproportionately people of color, people in segregated neighborhoods. It's a combination of bad police tactics. It's a combination of problems with the way police are recruited and maintained. It's a problem with the way we do policing in our segregated society, not just one person. And so in some cases, the one police officer who happens to be involved in the tragedy may not even be the most culpable person. You need to look at the entire structure, but just by saying, hey, it's a racist, you're actually not looking at the larger social problem that needs to be solved.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Is what in your book you call kind of racism without races. Sometimes, in all these instances, it's very difficult. The situation is very ambiguous, and all sort of like legalese arguments can be made to exculpate the person involved. But at the end of the day, that doesn't matter, even though, in the act it does. But it points to a social problem, as you put it. And sometimes the scandal, as you mentioned, to focus on one person or one utterance, occludes and actually thwarts, right, the dealing of the social problem. So in this, how do you relate also this racism without racist to racism by analogy? Because you make a lot of related arguments trying to parse out. It's just a really dense book in which you kind of like weave, let's use the metaphor, you know, a dressing metaphor, but you weave like a very complex fabric. One would be, you know, for it to be racism, you don't need a culpable individual.
Right.
You also say that argument of racism has been used by conservatives as reverse racism, and for multiculturalists as racism by analogy. You try to pin it down to a legal understanding of what discrimination really is. And also, you're making a wider structural claim about bringing politics back in.
Yes.
If I'm doing justice to.
Absolutely. Yes, so that's perfect. That's great. That is what I'm trying to do. So here, I mean, when we describe a social problem as racism, or racism by analogy, it's a nice point, because you'll often hear people say, well, if this were race, everyone would agree that it's terrible. And now you're starting to see these arguments made very, very broadly. So for instance, white evangelical Christians now are claiming to be the victims of discrimination. Never mind that they're the majority in the society and have lots of power and money and everything else, but they're the victims. It's just like racism, that people don't want to accept their religious views. Now, or even when what they're asking for is something like exemption from laws that apply equally to everybody else. So it's very, very pervasive. Now, it's a natural thing in one sense to say the civil rights movement occupies a very important place in the cultural imagination. And so when other groups want to advance their agenda, it's natural to say, hey, we're like the civil rights movement. Not saying that's always a bad thing. Just certainly there are many instances in which social justice struggles are similar, but it's become a rhetoric that's so easily deployed that almost anyone can do it. Now, one consequence, the reason people are so eager to adopt this rhetoric is because we've decided that if it's like racism, then game over. There's no more argument about it. So if I can say whatever it is I'm unhappy about is like racism, then I don't need to have an argument with my opponents about any of the political controversies, the normative conflicts, the distributive implications, because I win. It's like racism. We all have already decided that that's bad. I win, you lose. So there are a small number of issues, where that should be true. If someone's actually just discriminating on the basis of race, that should be the end of the discussion. That's wrong. But in many other instances, there are serious normative conflicts that have got to be worked out, political conflicts, and we don't even have a decent conversation when we begin with, it's like racism.
Because actually you thwart the conversation as opposed to having the real conversation that you need to have about these issues. You talk about these things also about scandals, and you move, if I'm interpreting you correctly, from the book Race Card, and previously your previous book, Racial Culture, that we're not going to kind of discuss, but it kind of like your argument builds up, right? From culture, from essentializing, and how you actually parse through the dimensions that are truly discriminatory and political and conducive to social integration, as opposed to those who kind of murky the waters and basically end up excluding, right, one another. No, so what you're saying in a way is that when everything is racism, then nothing is, and the structure remains completely untouched. So can you speak to that? Because you've done, I'm diverting here a little bit, but you've done very practical policy work at the housing office. So what are some of the levers that you would address to part through what is like legal discrimination and the policy interventions that would help address some of these issues? And we'll get back to the culture of, but
okay,
can help.
So Well, let's take an example. I could go back to the example of police violence.
Mhm.
Though there no doubt are a discrete category of cases in which we have a racist police officer who needs to be drummed off the force. We see that they're white supremacist on police forces, and if they are detected, they should be fired. I agree with that. There are another discrete number of cases in which you have someone where there's a clear abuse of authority, or an abuse of power, and those need to be detected and prosecuted appropriately. But then there are a huge number of other instances which are a big part of the problem of racial injustice in law enforcement that don't fall into those two categories, where it's day-to-day policing and the day-to-day tactics of policing that are disproportionately affecting people of color, making their lives difficult, making it hard for them to find gainful employment, undermining their dignity. But they're not racist police officers, or at least we can't be sure. And they're law enforcement tactics that are lawful and that are accepted. Now, what do we do about that? One issue has to do with segregated neighborhoods. So when the police say we're going to go and we're going to have aggressive tactics in a high crime neighborhood, at first blush that sounds reasonable. Of course, it's what any sensible person would do. So the high crime neighborhoods turn out to be disproportionate minority, and then their aggressive tactics are all directed at those minority residents. But then you get a cascade. People who are basically innocent get caught up in the criminal justice system for minor offenses that you would get away with. It wouldn't even be a problem in other parts of town. They're caught up in the criminal justice system. They have, they can't pay bail. They have warrants out for their arrest. All of this. That's a structural set of issues that need to be addressed, and that has to do with making the appropriate balance between the need for public safety, and that's a real thing. Just saying defund the police doesn't address the fact that we do have crime and we do need law enforcement. But that versus the costs to innocent people and in neighborhoods where police are policing aggressively. So we've got a big social problem to unravel. There's an example, and there are mechanisms to do it. We could return to questions of how we desegregate neighborhoods. These were vital questions for the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. We've kind of dropped that. Everyone's given up on trying to address those problems. I think we need to come back to that if we're ever going to have real, a racially just society.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. That's an excellent point, because in your book you suggest these things because it's not actually addressed to that, but moving also to rights gone wrong, and it's also an argument that you ran through the race card that in terms of cultural kind of nuances I always want to go back to, but basically you're saying that the civil rights accomplished a lot, but in their full faith in them, they have been misused and abused. And not only that have precluded, you just put it in these terms, like they have occupied the field of social justice. I know that's a legal term. If you can elaborate on that, that would be great. But also in terms, of how this society understands itself, there's a very ingrained methodological individualism and legalism that has taken priority over public interest and politics. So these are all dimensions that reinforce one another, right? Yes. They people think that in solving the legal issue, you will solve the collective social problem, and that's right.
Yes, absolutely. So let's take an example from the civil rights movement. The March on Washington was a march for jobs and freedom. And people often forget that. So what about the jobs in particular? And over time, this agenda, which was not just a legal agenda, but was a socioeconomic agenda. It was an agenda about making sure that people of color, but also all poor people were had access to resources and opportunities that they didn't have in our society. We haven't done too well in addressing that problem. What we did instead was we got a legalistic solution, which was we'll have some laws that prohibit discrimination because of race. Now, I don't want to downplay all the importance of those laws. It's extremely important, and it was a huge victory to get those laws. However, over time, the racial justice struggle became synonymous with those legal reforms, so that now we talk about it as the civil rights movement. It's about rights, which is a legal concept. And thinking about it in terms of legalism and legal responses has a few unfortunate consequences. One is that there's a sense that grew, and I think has become quite pervasive, that if you vindicate the formal legal rights that are articulated, then you solve the problem. And any remaining inequality is just, the result of individual effort or market forces or whatever. It's not a problem. It's not a social justice problem anymore, because we've already solved the social justice problem by vindicating rights.
Individual
I think that's wrong.
Yeah, individual morality. Basically, the weight
Yeah.
is on the individual.
Right. So the weight's on there's individual morality on the part of the person who might be discriminating. That's immoral. Stop discriminating. And then once that's done, well, we let the chips lie where they fall. So, and here's just one of the striking examples that I talk about in Rights Gone Wrong. You begin with Brown versus Board of Education, where there's a clear understanding among everyone involved that the target here is Jim Crow segregation, and the solution is to have desegregated schools in which not just where the legal impediment to racial mixing is removed, but that would actually vindicate the ideal of a society in which people interacted at an equal basis without respect to race, without respect to skin color. 50 years later, when two school districts are, one of them in the South, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, trying to desegregate their schools. You're still trying 50 years later. They have a mechanism in order to do that requires some race consciousness. Let's look at the race of the people that are going to the magnet schools and try to make sure that we get a racially diverse student body. And the Supreme Court strikes it down under the same law, in the same legal provision that vindicated Brown versus Board of Education, saying what Brown versus Board of Education really stood for was the proposition that the state can never consider race. And that kind of 180-degree reversal of the practical political struggle is only possible through legalism. That's legal chicanery at its most pernicious. And the only reason that's possible is because the political struggle got turned into a legal idea. And then it could be manipulated by lawyers and judges in a way that's quite opposite to the political struggle.
That's an amazing point. There's so much to cover in like what you said, but there is this, move to the courts that you just mentioned, in your books. The legalism of this understanding of the individuals and the rights are like pillars of the society had led to these, legalism and a lot of emphasis on the courts. So, I would rephrase that argument. The way I understand it is like politics has been transferred to the courts. And this is something that Republicans have understood crystal clear, right? And another point that you're making, related to the courts is that the courts don't judge anymore, right? Mm-hmm. They don't pass value judgment. It's a very Arendtian argument. I know that we discussed this, previously, but they have suspended judgment in favor of legal acrobatics, if you want, that are not deprived of values, but there's not the purpose. You call in for bringing back the purpose of what those rights stood for. Related to that, I wanted to ask you, because there are a lot of rulings. I'm not, like a legal expert, but you have very strong views about this and diversity and affirmative action. So if you can speak to that, you'd like a adamant critic, right?
Well,
to argument of diversity.
Oh, I am a critic, and yeah, I don't know if I'd say adamant, but I'm certainly a critic, and I'm a critic. And what maybe distinguishes me from most people is that, I'm in favor of affirmative action, 100%. I'm critical of the diversity rationale for affirmative action, because what the diversity rationale wound up doing, and it's worth remembering that, when affirmative action was attacked in 1978 in the Bakke case, that the Supreme Court was split so that the diversity rationale was the result of one man's judgment. Justice Lewis Powell, one person, decided that the only reason that you could have affirmative action would be in order to promote diversity. And diversity, turned out to be a way not to talk about racial injustice. So you could have a view of affirmative action, and indeed, four of the members of the Supreme Court at the time would have endorsed this view, that it was designed to remedy societal discrimination, that it was a response to widespread, racial injustice and our history of discrimination. Now that would have given you a very different conversation about affirmative action, but instead you got the Lewis Powell's idea of diversity. And that says the only reason you can do it is in order to promote the pedagogical aims of the university with respect to, that can be furthered by having, a diverse group of people in a classroom setting. Now, what that argument does is it leaves racial injustice completely out of the conversation, and so we don't ever need to talk about that. And in fact, you can't talk about it. Because if you do, you're kind of suggesting that you're doing it for the wrong reasons, for reasons that are unconstitutional. It's distorted our entire conversation about racial injustice, and it's made this kind of racism by analogy or race by analogy argument much easier to perform, because if the idea is just pedagogical diversity and having a bunch of different voices in the classroom, and that's why we're doing it, well then, why just racial diversity? Why not all these other types of diversity? Why not ideological diversity? None of this has anything to do with the original purposes of affirmative action, and it doesn't further social justice, and it's the kind of thing that really should be left to the discretion of the university and not have a legal standing. But because we've talked about it in terms of diversity, all this other stuff gets brought in to a conversation. I think ultimately it's made affirmative action on shakier legal ground, more vulnerable to legal attack, but worse yet, it's made our whole conversation about social justice distorted. So now everyone's talking about diversity, even outside the affirmative action context, instead of talking about racial injustice.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that argument, particularly when you say, why not libertarians count for diversity, or evangelical Christians, religious diversity in all sort of possible ways, or ideological, as you mentioned. I mean, I'm glad you brought up this point, because this is when we get to the core of these like very difficult entanglement. And this is why I like, your book that tries to kind of parse through, all these arguments. But the argument of diversity is in many ways, although not exclusively, let me rephrase. Diversity is related to multiculturalism, and multiculturalism has become this kind of umbrella bag for all sorts of different ways. And this is where your racism, by analogy, kind of plays in. Could you speak to that point, particularly the multiculturalism taking racism as a cultural issue, and what the complexity and dangers of that are?
Yes. So, and I don't want to say that all forms and versions of multiculturalism are a bad thing, but I do think that one of the version of multiculturalism that's become kind of mainstream and that started to inform our way of thinking about civil rights issues and legal issues has a big problem. So the move is to say questions of race discrimination are really questions of cultural discrimination. So we redefine race as a question of cultural difference. And the goal then is to ensure that we don't discriminate on the basis of culture in the same way that we wouldn't discriminate on the basis of race. So right away, one thing that we've done is really oversimplified the relationship between race and culture, so that now every race comes with a culture, and we, our goal is to ensure that the attributes of the culture that belongs to the race aren't subject to discrimination. What again? Notice we're not talking about racial injustice directly. We're not talking about the history of exploitation. We're not talking about the history of subordination. We've turned this into a problem of a culture clash. Like, oh, gee, we just don't understand each other because I'm speaking with a different accent, or I like different food, or something like this. This is these are real social issues, but I don't think that they're the core issues of racial injustice in our society. But if we talk about that, and people seem to be more comfortable talking about that than racial injustice, and with respect to cultural clashes, these in fact are ultimately normative political questions that have to be worked out. There's not a right answer. So it's just not true that because something is my culture, I'm entitled to have everyone accommodate it. Society can't function that way. Sometimes things that are a part of someone's culture cannot be accommodated. Again, let's just give an easy example, because once you introduce this multicultural idea, it can spread. If I'm a white person, daughter of the Confederacy in the South, I have a culture. And part of my culture involves the Stars and Bars flag and the statues of Robert E. Lee. And when people say that needs to go, you're attacking my culture. And I want cultural accommodation. We're already seeing arguments that look an awful lot like that. But the truth is, this is a normative political question. And sometimes people lose, even though it is their culture. And even if their culture is something that you might say in some senses is innocent within how they experience it. They're not advancing it with nefarious intent. Nevertheless, if there's a clash, sometimes one side has to win that clash. Another version would be, if evangelical Christian says, part of my culture is to believe that gay people are inferior and engaged in perversion, and therefore they can't, be treated with respect. We can't accommodate that in a society that's, in a cosmopolitan society that's devoted to equal dignity for people. And so we have to say that part of your culture, we can't embrace. And multiculturalism just doesn't get us anywhere in trying to resolve those kinds of issues.
No, because to these points, I have so many kind of lines of not questioning of questions, not of questioning that came to my mind. I mean, your books are so rich, pun intended, right? Rich, yeah. Anyways, no, because the argument, the displacement, from race to culture has like a more daily displacement that is very pervasive, understanding difference, right? Cultural difference, as you suggested, as a chain of equivalences, right? Mm-hmm. So what you actually do is just completely eclipse not only disparities, but actually structural inequality.
Yes.
So that's how it operates. It makes us different without making us unequal in a structural way.
Great, yes.
So the discussion is just completely gone. So to that point, how do you go back to reclaim the racial and structural inequalities that are worth distinguishing conceptually and political and such? And how do you intervene?
Great. I think one thing that's made me hopeful is some of the recent Black Lives Matter movement has started to do this. So you'll notice in the last, this is just this year, the protests surrounding the murders of George Floyd, for instance, that people have started to say, we need to look at this as a structural problem. less focus on the one bad police officer. So compare that to what happened back in the 1990s with Rodney King, where everything's focused on these police officers and what they did. Now, again, I don't want to say that they deserve to get off the hook. Certainly not. They were terrible people, and what they did was wrong, horrific. But there was also a structural problem, and people didn't focus enough on that. Now people are starting to say, look, let's talk about the whole way the criminal justice system is criminalizing, relatively modest activity. Let's talk about the structure of police departments and the way that they protect their own, no matter how bad the police officer is. Let's talk about aggressive policing in minority neighborhoods. Those are the real issues that could start to get you to actually, comprehensive improvements. And so there's an example. I think that we are getting better at this. I'd say, again, in my view, neighborhood segregation and the and concentration of poverty is perhaps the single biggest racial injustice in our society. It's the one from which everything else follows. So even the quite horrific and salient example of police violence actually is a consequence of segregation and the concentration of poverty. But for that, a lot of the things that the police are doing wouldn't have the racial impact that they're having. But for that, there would be more widespread outrage about abusive police tactics, because they'd be more likely to affect a broader cross-section of society and not just people of color who are isolated. So those are examples of how we could intervene. Now, it's hard to do. A lot would need to be done in order to fix this problem, but at least zeroing in on the right problems is a step forward.
This again, it branches out in so many different ways, because on the one hand, you're saying it is not the one at a time logic, the logic of one at a time, like it doesn't work. You need to address this from different, entry points. But at the same time, you're saying if we have to prioritize just one, it would be concentration of poverty, because the concentration of poverty and socializing, I heard you said in one of your interventions somewhere, I can't recall exactly, that we need to understand, and this kind of really kind of shocked me, like we need to understand that a lot of these people segregated do not even know what the job market looks like, right? And how you have to like be punctual and be presentable. We'll talk about this, when we discuss the dress book, but the presentation is a huge aspect of, acceptability and kind of an entry point, as well. And with that, you at least have like the minimum basis to continue with integration at different levels. So segregation is not spatial, but it's actually in terms of like the ethos and the daily self-understanding of society.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So, and so one thing you see that the sociologist William Julius Wilson wrote quite compellingly about this. But if you have someone who lives in a impoverished neighborhood, and he's describing the South Side of Chicago in the 1980s, 1990s, but it's still just as bad today, maybe worse. You have people who, in some cases, they don't know anyone who has a regular job. The entire economy and everything that they experience on a day-to-day basis involves the gray market economy and things like this. And so what are they have no way of internalizing the norms of the mainstream economy. They may be very good at internalizing the norms of their own milieu. And those norms are going to get them by on a day-to-day basis. They're also going to get them entangled with the police on occasion, because that's what the gray market economy is. It's low-level criminal offenses. It's selling loose cigarettes. It's things like that. But it's not going to help them get out. In fact, it's going to be a problem from getting out. Yes, that's and it's not a question of saying we need to accommodate the the norms of concentrated poverty, because they're just not functional outside that environment. But it's also not a question of blaming those people or saying that they're not intelligent, or that they're not diligent, or that they don't have the work ethic. Many of they certainly do have the work ethic. It's just they're working at different things and they're developing different skills, and those skills don't translate outside of their environment. So that's why that this concentration of poverty is such an impediment to getting to a just society.
Yeah, that made me think. I mean, that's the argument exactly that I wanted to bring about, because then, at that point is when you bring up again, I mean, not explicitly in your book, but when you bring up ambiguities, because, to have segregated, groups, I'm going to put it like that, segregated groups join the mainstream society, there are all sorts of like giving up your own culture, right? Buying into, let's put it, the white culture. So there are all these issues, of raising these terms that are more exclusionary than integrational. It also play to prevent that from happening. I am not going to subdue myself and buy into that model that has oppressed me, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you make you make an analogous argument. I mean, there's so much to talk about the race card, but you make an analogous argument in dress codes also, and that is Sunday best for the civil rights movement. What am I doing? Am I challenging and getting out of the situation that I am, or I'm actually subordinating and buying into the codes of dressability and respectability of whites? Right?
Yes, absolutely. I find it's a very difficult and fraught question. And one of the things I want to focus on in dress codes is right now you have kind of a conversation where the politics of respectability, among activists and people on the left, it's a bad thing. It means that you're a sellout, as you're saying, you're kind of buying into the power structure. You're trying to ingratiate yourself with people who are powerful when you should be resisting. And there is that element of it, but at the same time, when you look at the Sunday best ethos of the civil rights movement, and it's very clear, they had a dress code. We're going to go and sit in at a lunch counter. We're going to conduct a march for civil rights. You need to show up looking sharp. If you show up looking a mess, you can't come, because you're going to undermine the image we're trying to present. Now, is that image just trying to ingratiate yourself to white people? I don't think so. These were brave and fierce radicals who were pushing for an agenda that was going to overturn the ethos of their society. They weren't trying to ingratiate themselves. But what Sunday Best was doing was saying, we're people who deserve dignity. And this is dignified dress in our society. We're dignified and we have pride in ourselves. And that's a threat, actually, to the white power structure. They want, and indeed, when you look at the history of race relations in the United States, white racists did not want to see Black people who were well-dressed. They got angry about it. They passed laws to try to stop it in some instances. They attacked well-dressed Black people. And so that was the history going into the civil rights movement, where this was an assertion of pride and really in many ways of defiance.
So I jumped into the dress because you share my two passions, basically, social political analysis and style and clothing. So, but let me rewind a little bit so I introduce everyone to, your book Dress Codes and just to see why this is related. I mean, you've been like an discrimination lawyer in employment, and besides having the inspiration of your father, I see this book very much as a tribute, right, to your father, which is like very, very sweet in so many respects. But basically this book comes out of your work as a anti-discrimination lawyer, and you've seen that in employment there were like all these civil cases about dress codes and grooming, right, related to discrimination. So this is how you get to the dress code and the assumption that dressing is as personal and social as you can get, that it conveys both personal and social and political meaning, and many times is discarded as trivial, as in some of the cases that you just depict in the book and also in racial culture, but it's not. Right. Because when you look at dress codes and when you look at, you know, all sort of like political movements, they're very much part of political meanings. So this is when you, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So when I started writing this book, one of the things that prompted it, you're right that, you know, my father's influence, he was a community organizer, he was an activist, he was a scholar, he worked, he was the university administrator, also a Presbyterian minister, and he was trained as a tailor. And so he cared a lot about clothing and he understood the importance of it. So that was one influence. Another, where I got back into it from my work in racial justice and civil rights issues, was that you see a lot of litigation in employment over dress codes. And what always struck me was that when you looked at the way the courts would analyze these cases, there was the move to say, well, this doesn't really matter. It's kind of trivial. And yet, you know, here people are fighting over it. The employer is insisting on having a dress code. The employee doesn't want. The employees insist on refusing to adhere to the dress code. Why? So that's a lot of fight for something that doesn't matter. And so why does it matter so much to everyone? And looking into the history of both fashion and the regulation of fashion, since I'm a lawyer, I got into it through looking at rules. You know, I saw how much it really mattered to social justice struggles, that self-presentation was such a way, was always a political statement. It was this, because it's a statement about who I am and how I fit into society, where I belong in society, and nothing could be more political than that. And that visual statement that people make through their attire, in many cases, can be more powerful and more persuasive than, you know, a written polemic or a speech or anything else, because you're demonstrating it to everyone, and at the same time you're living it. You're wearing this on your body. And so the history of civil rights struggles and how important it was for people to dress in a particular way, and the struggles around clothing were, you know, very, very striking. But I look at them throughout history, and so you can see from the late Middle Ages forward the you know, profound political and social importance of fashion and dress in history.
I swallowed your book, and the book is coming out, you know, in February, but I was very fortunate and privileged to get a pre-copy in order to read it. I mean, this is fascinating because you claim in the book, I mean, we talk about clothes, but the dress codes come with more force in moments of social and political upheaval, right? Like when meanings and traditional categories, and this is again Arendt that I read always in you, I don't know why, but you know, traditional categories are shaky.
Yes.
Right? We can think about transgender, we can think about non-binary. I don't know how that would play in discrimination law when you have to just put equal burden or not an equal burden, you know, on different sexes. But I wanted to discuss about, you know, the dress codes, different instances in which you see a racial or demographic, you know, struggle center around issues, you know, of clothing. One is the runaways, the runaway slaves.
Yes.
That made a huge impression on me. That would take not money, not food, let's say, but clothes. Right. Clothes that would put them, you know, in a place socially to be seen as freed. And the other one that I had no clue about was the suit riots.
Oh, yes.
And the pachucos and stuff like that. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating. Like, I super recommend the book. It's just full of pearls. Anyways.
Yes. So in with respect to the runaway slaves, if you in the pre-colonial period is well 1740. There's an act in South Carolina called the Negro Act, which says that the blacks and slaves may not dress above their condition, and then it lists a whole series of things that they can't wear. So already you have the power structures trying to regulate what people can wear, so that one, you can tell who's a slave by by what they're wearing, and it reinforces a racial hierarchy that's now right at that moment beginning to sharpen up, but not it's not yet at its height. That comes much later in American history. So there's this worry about blacks dressing in a fashionable manner and what that does to the social hierarchy. When you begin to have slaves escaping, they understand that bringing particular types of clothing with them will give them an advantage. One, it'll let them pass themselves off as not slaves, as either free blacks or as people who have a right to be where they are. They also are a source of currency, so they can trade or sell the clothing. If you have good clothing, you can trade it for other clothing, and then if the slave catchers are on your trail, you could switch and change your appearance. So it had a lot of meaning like that, but it also had significance for personal dignity. And it became clear really early in looking at some of the accounts of slaves and runaway slaves that the clothing was important for them, for their sense of self and for their sense of dignity. And it wasn't just that they were copying the styles of white people or Europeans, but they would take those styles and adapt them to make them quite personal in some circumstances. And so it was taking the symbols that were existed in the society, but in reusing them for their own purposes. And that's one of the themes of the book that I see over and over again. It's also one of the themes of the Zoot Suit. So when you get to the Zoot Suit riots, and for those of you who don't know, the Zoot Suit was this big kind of dramatic suit with a long jacket with long tails and long jacket skirts and very baggy pants, and they emerged in the 1930s, but by the 1940s they were a style that was associated with some jazz musicians. So the great jazz band leader Cab Calloway was famous for his big zoot suit, and you could find footage of him wearing that. But jazz musicians, African Americans, and Latinos. And in Los Angeles, the Latinos in particular really adopted their group of them really adopted the zoot suit. And Octavio Paz writes about this group of people, young people, as pachucos, and gives a really poetic account of their use of clothing as an expression of their self-esteem, but also of their alienation. And, he describes them sort of as modern day dandies, and the dandies in earlier periods in history were people who spent obsessive attention to their dress, and it was, but it also expressed a sort of spiritual alienation from society. So he sees that in the pachucos. Anyway, they were just living their lives wearing their zoot suits, and were really made people angry. And as a result, when white American servicemen came back from the war or had furloughs in Los Angeles, they went looking for these pachucos to beat them up. And it was just an organized attempt to find them, strip them of their clothes, burn their clothes, humiliate them. And the result was what were known as the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943. Now, it turns out that was the biggest example of it, but there were Zoot Suit riots in cities all over the United States are very similar, some involving Latinos, some involving African Americans, some involving white ethnic groups. So the Zoot Suit was also taken up by Italian Americans, Irish Americans, and some other instances, but they were always people who were kind of on the margins of mainstream society. And the very fact of them wearing the Zoot Suit was seen as such a threat to the mainstream, morality, that people felt the need to hunt them down and try to beat them up.
the compelling point about the suits with riots that I actually had no idea is that it's true, and it's a lot of time understated in this society, even though it's in your face. I mean, literally, is that the visual is more compelling as meaning, as a message, that what you can compel verbally. You say you don't have a second chance to give a first impression, and it goes around. But politically, when it's used, appropriately, because you also make a point about, symbolism with that political goal and political and politics, in race card or in rights gone wrong. But I mean, I read it as translating into dress codes at, style without substance and without meaning is also, iffy in a way, because style has a meaning, and you need to be aware of the unintended effects of the action of that style if you're not, on point about the substance of it.
Yes, right, absolutely. People need to pay attention to the message that they're sending, because they always are sending some sort of a message. And it is striking that, in that sense, people understood that, the Pachucos, the Zoot Suit rioters, were making an oppositional statement of a kind. Now, they weren't saying, we want to overthrow the government, or we want to, change the laws or anything like that. But it was a clear statement of alienation from the mainstream, and people took it that way and understood it as a threat.
Right. It was an argument about integration, about wanting a place in society and not having it. Right. Yeah. Well, that's how I read it. And this brings me to a point that also goes, throughout, that is about cultural appropriation in the way, in the way I read your arguments. I read that you oppose this understanding of cultural appropriations because you see a more fluid and dynamic, complex and ambiguous kind of usage, rejection, incorporation, right? Not only of the use of rights and just be aware of the meaning and the effects, but also of the word of close. What do they mean? And more than anything else, what's the context? Like the context is, intrinsically linked with why you wear what you wear, and how you wear it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all, I sometimes use the metaphor of language, although I don't think it's a perfect metaphor. But if you think of us living in a society as having a common sartorial vocabulary, that there's certain items of clothing that are out there that they have a meaning in society, but of course, like words, you can change the meaning by putting them in a different context. Nevertheless, they still rely on the old meaning. That's why they have significance, so that people see a particular item of clothing and they have some sense of why that's significant because of other people who've worn it in the past. Now, in one sense, that means that in order to do anything new, you have to appropriate, because you need to take something that could possibly have meaning and then recombine it in some new way in order to make a new type of statement. So, the Zoot Suit was taking the suit, which was a classic symbol of masculine prerogative, of sober business judgment, of responsibility, of the work ethic, but they turned it into something different. And that's a statement, but they had to take the suit. They couldn't just pick something at random that no one ever wore before, no one ever saw. So when you get to questions of cultural appropriation, well, of course, it's inevitable that people are going to adopt things from other cultural traditions and other contexts and bring them into a contemporary framing, because that's the only possible thing you could do to create a distinctive style, one that expresses your own personality. I'm sure there are examples of cultural appropriation that are really offensive and that should be condemned. But I can't agree with the idea that anytime someone from a different cultural group adopts something, associated with a group that's not their own, that they are doing something wrong or objectionable.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more radical, if I may say, at this point. I think that there might very well be instances of offensive cultural appropriation, but I think at the end of the day, I am more of the idea, as you pose, about multiculturalism, that this like slide to culture and equivalence in culture, what it's doing is pitting people against each other as opposed to add meaning to meaning and come closer. But that's that's my personal opinion. You also bring these arguments to women, to religious, wearing. I mean, it's a lot to cover, so I'm gonna leave this teaser, for people. If you have any comment, if not, I would go to the questions. But do you have any comment that it came to you that you would like to cover?
No, I think we covered, this was terrific. You asked such great questions that we've covered so much. I mean, I could talk a lot more about this book, but I know we need to also talk about, go to question and answer. So, I'll just put it, so this is the book, if people are interested, and this is what it'll actually look like, because the publisher just sent me the hard copy, but it's out February 9th.
No, that's awesome. So we have, we already have a lot of questions. So Jonathan March is asking, one of the trends that I found distressing was growing judicial consensus over time that the disparate impacts is not addressed by the 5th and the 14th Amendment equal rights protections. What are the possible ways to push back? Is it fair to criticize theories of how to construe legislative intent that consistently fail to address disparate impact because they find that opaque? It's a very dense question.
Yes.
You have it in Q&A. If you want to take a few seconds, to read, and for everyone, please submit the questions via Q&A. We have some already.
Yes. So I agree that the disparate impact theory provided a way forward to addressing structural issues of discrimination, and that it's very unfortunate that it's been confined and not applied in the context of constitutional law. So what you're describing, and just for people who don't know what the disparate impact theory is, one could think about race discrimination and ways to prove race discrimination in one of two ways. One is that you find discriminatory intent. So you figure out that the person making the decision did so because they wanted to keep Black people down, or they wanted to keep women out, or they were thinking about race at the time. Another would be, you look at the consequences and you say, this has a disparate impact. It's really harming one racial group much more than the other one. So we need to take a hard look at that and ask whether there's another way to accomplish whatever whatever we're trying to accomplish. Can you do this without having this disparate impact? And if you can, you should. To scrutinize that under the legal framework. We do this in the employment context. So in employment, an employment practice that has a disparate impact is presumptively unlawful. But we don't do it to government action under the 14th Amendment of the Equal Protection Clause. The courts decided not to extend the doctrine there, and that's made it much harder to get at the kinds of structural inequalities that we're talking about. So I agree entirely. And how to push back, I think we shouldn't give up on disparate impact, and a lot of people have, simply because the courts have said, have been quite hostile to it. But I agree with the person asking the question that we need to continue to push to have disparate impact recognized. And in a moment like this, where people are beginning to see the deep structural inequalities in our society, perhaps this is a good point to try to revive the disparate impact theory.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. And so Debbie Nosowski asks, Obama's 2015 rules intended to end racial discrimination in housing bill with federal funds run into problems in San Francisco, which struggled to preserve the little left of its African-American community by allowing set-asides for them. I don't recall the exact details. Please comment on the competing and equal compelling goals.
Okay. I think I know what you're talking about. I wasn't involved in the housing authority at that time. That was way after I had left. So I may not be as familiar with it as I could be, but yes, there is often a tension between the idea of strict non-discrimination on the one hand and the goals of recognizing race in order to remedy racial inequities or injustices. So we talked about that a little bit. It comes up in the affirmative action context. This one was a pretty distinctive context because here we're talking about a situation in which, for the most part, in cities that are racially segregated, it's a problem to, and it's understood as a legal problem to allow the concentration of one race in any given form of public housing, because you're segregating your city according to race. Now, in San Francisco, where there's so few African Americans left, I think what the question is getting at is that if you don't allow a concentration of African Americans in a particular housing project, the consequence could be to essentially force out the few you have left in the city. So you've got a different environment where in many cities there are lots of African Americans, and the issue isn't that you're driving them out of town; it's that you're segregating them into one part of town. But in San Francisco, the issue is really that there are very few African Americans left anywhere, and the first goal needs to be to keep them in the city at all. And so you've got a kind of a different demographic problem.
Thank you. And Malcolm Gison, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. If we agree that most urban areas in our country, including San Francisco, have segregated our Black residents, what can be done today that will result in Black people living in other areas of San Francisco?
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. And the history of race segregation is so long and so entrenched that the reforms necessary in many cases might be pretty radical. It does seem to me that deliberate and focused policies designed to integrate neighborhoods are necessary at this point, and that might involve for instance, the deliberate citing of some kinds of low-income housing in neighborhoods where that are more upper income. They might involve direct incentives. In San Francisco is a really tough case because, as the earlier questioner pointed out, the African American population is already so small, and the forces of gentrification are pushing people out. But that's that's the result of market forces that are well beyond the capacity of the city to do anything about. And it gets even more vexed because in many instances, the actual displacement of African Americans is not, it's due to them getting a great offer for the property that they own and moving somewhere else. So, in that case, you could say, it's good for the person who says, well, I can get $1 million for this house in San Francisco and go move to Richmond and buy, a nice big house. I'm going to take that. That's not a bad thing for that individual, but it's bad for the racial integration of the city when lots of African Americans are doing that. The whole neighborhood changes, and so the ones that are left are increasingly less comfortable there, have fewer of the amenities that they want. The neighborhood's, changing and gentrifying, and that's making them even more likely to want to leave. So those are the kinds of problems for confronting gentrifying cities. They're very different than the problems confronting cities that aren't gentrifying. And San Francisco's, probably the most rapidly gentrifying city in the United States right now. So I know I didn't quite answer what should we do about it because the answers are complicated, and they, in many instances, they involve things that would meet with a lot of political resistance.
So if I may make a comment about this, we go back at this point, to the tension between the individual and the structure, because while the individual decision makes perfect rational and well-being kind of sense, in terms of structure, how you leave the city integrated with like a very kind of critical presence of African Americans gets completely undermined by the individual decision. And when you do not have a public entity that's going to put that as a public interest, as a priority, it's individual who makes the decision, which is analogous to, what we were discussing earlier. Yes.
Nice.
So we have another question. Barry Emanuel quotes, don't judge the book by the cover, lapses. True or not true? We do judge by how one looks and how you probably looks, and you probably did research what to put on the cover of your book for how it would appeal and sell, not just judge by attire, but nice furniture in law office, etc. Please speak to this. I love this question.
Yes, this is a great question. To some degree, it's inevitable and even justified that people judge based on appearances. It's an interesting thing. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, only superficial don't judge based on appearances. And one way of thinking about this is that when people say don't judge a book by its cover, they're making a sharp distinction between substance and surface. So the cover is just the surface. Who cares? What you care about is what's inside. And we can distinguish those because we know you can take the cover off and the rest of the book is still there. But that's not the way things work in other contexts of society. When we present ourselves to the world, for instance, we're wearing clothes. Now, sure, in theory, you can take the clothes off and wear some other clothes, but you're always wearing something and you're making decisions about how to present yourself to the world. And that's what people experience. It's not just what they see, but it's also what they experience. That matters. That's essential to how we behave as social individuals. So I don't think it's superficial, and it's reasonable to make some conjectures about that based, about other things based on appearance, just as it's reasonable to judge, any other aspect of a person's, self-presentation. We have to do that. There's really no alternative to doing that as individuals in a society. And, in terms of you're right, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to put on this book cover in order to convey what we wanted to convey, so that the buyer would have a sense of what the book was like. We wanted it to look good. We wanted it to be stylish. We wanted it to convey both, the ancient and the modern. There are a lot of things that went into that, and that tells you something about the person who wrote the book, to be sure.
Yeah, I love this issue because there are issues also of dissonance between what you wear and your context or what you stand for, and they have consequences. And I think that, I encourage people to ask more questions in the Q&A, but, I'm of the strong opinion that, that Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I know this is going to be very controversial, but she had like two dissonant messages between what she was actually standing for verbally and how she was dressing. She was not appealing to the diverse audience that she was performatively appealing to. There was a dissonance with messages that Michelle Obama had mastered incredibly well in the past, with the exception of straightening her hair, right? That is a very controversial, but this is my personal opinion. And I know, a lot of people are not going to agree with that. If you want to speak to that, and please, I encourage you to ask more questions. We still have, sometimes, otherwise I have many more.
Well, yeah, it's really the question of hair, straightening Black people's hair and what, its texture is such a fraught and complicated one, because there was certainly a time when, let's say the late 1960s, during the height of the Black is Beautiful movement, where straightening your hair would be seen as a real sign of, kind of a bad political statement, self-hatred, contempt, what have you. That's not true today. And one of the things that's so, I've really struggled with the hair issue because I began when I first wrote about legal cases that involve challenges to dress codes and hair. But I took the position that, well, this is kind of superficial. It doesn't really matter that much. That's not a civil rights issue. And researching this book has really made me change my mind about that. So, the question of hair for self-esteem and dignity, particularly for Black women, is quite profound. And so now I feel, after having read this book, that things like the Crown Act, which is a law that would prohibit discrimination on the basis of hair texture, are a great idea, but not because of a general idea that we have to accommodate all aspects of culture. I don't think that, but because of the specific meaning and the specific significance of hair, and particularly for Black women. I mean, I really think that is the issue there. Now, Michelle Obama straightening her hair is, in a sense, a statement, but of course, in today's environment, Black women do all sorts of different things with their hair, just like white women, and just like Asian women, and the freedom to do what you want to with your hair, I think, is a really important thing. Now, there are limits, and it's always going to send a message. You're absolutely right about that. And no doubt, one thing that Michelle Obama is doing is sending a message that, she's a strong, empowered, proud Black woman, also, who, is also, in the mainstream of, kind of middle American society in some senses, and the hair puts her there. It's a very, in some sense, it's a very conventional, for lack of a better word, bourgeois style for a middle-aged Black woman to have. It's very fashionable, but it's also, it sends that kind of a message, which is, I think, the message she's trying to send. But it'd be really interesting to see, what message would it send if she had braids, for instance. That would be a different message, and one that might, some voters might find more alienating, complicated.
Complicated, and I point to the ambiguities in all of this. I mean, they're not univocal many times. The way that we appropriate different dress codes and how we combine them, and of course, at the end of the day, there's going to be dispute, and they're empty signifiers, right? Like, we're going to project different things into that. I want to go to a more structured kind of point. In your book, The Race Card, I mean, I encourage people, we still have time for more questions, but if not, you say that the social and legal meaning of racism is in a state of crisis, that there are not, openly explicit, I'm being redundant here, bigots. And your book was published, if I remember correctly, in 2008. A lot has happened since then. And when we talked, you said that you would review some of the statements that you made. And I'm wondering whether this is one of them, and how you would reframe it in terms of, the meaning of racism today.
Yes, I would. Certainly the Trump era has revealed a lot and also changed a lot. So I would admit that when I wrote The Race Card, I had underestimated the pervasiveness of just overt white supremacy in this country. I certainly understood that it was there and it was a factor, but it's more widespread than I thought. I'll admit that. And Trump in particular changed the norms. So when I wrote The Race Card, it really was true that it was very rare to hear somebody who would make an overtly bigoted statement. I wasn't naive. I knew that they were bigots, but they hid it. And one of the problems I tried to confront in The Race Card was, what do you do in a society that is saturated with racism, but where everyone's denying it, and people who you're in the position of feeling like you're being gaslighted. Like, no, there's no racism here, but my God, why are there all these terrible results? And the structure, focus on structure is a way to get at that. But, I underestimated the amount of overt racism that's now come to the surface, or I didn't predict, the way overt racism could be kind of re-energized and reactivated so readily. that was a bit of a shock to me, and I think a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, those are things that I would, I'd say somewhat differently today.
Yeah, because you also say that like the race card exacerbates distrust between races. So that argument was already there in order to just the next step, which is making legitimate that distrust would come, as an openly bigoted argument, right? How do you see, the race card today in view of this unity and healing language? I know we discussed this, but for everybody.
Right. Oh, that is a difficult question, because
I know, but that's the most interesting one.
yes, I mean, because it's you're right. I still believe you do need trust, and despite what I just said before about the underestimating the amount of white supremacy, I also do think that there, the people who are decent or have the potential to be decent and far outnumber the terrible bigots, and that there's a lot of distrust in our current political environment that is, bears responsibility for where we are. If we could overcome that, we might be able to arrive at some improvement and some solutions. So we still need that. What people are constantly being manipulated by by, I'll just say it, right-wing media and social media and the like, and that's provoking distrust on the one hand, and but it is also provoking in some cases an overreaction on the other side. So if you accusations of racism and bias are still overused, and the claim is still made sometimes in too unequivocal a tone, and that's being done to compensate for the fact that there's denial and retrenchment on the other side. But I worry that it's actually just creating more and more distrust, because if you get someone who's saying you're making some extreme statement about the everyone's a racist, or then some people are going to say, oh, I really need to take that on board and try to fix it. But just as many are going to say, that's nonsense. There they go again. There go the liberals with their and we can't come together. We need to have a definition of racism that people can agree on, and facts that we can agree on to actually have a productive conversation. And I worry that a lot of, even today, the contemporary conversation is rhetoric. That's not, that's designed to produce an effect or produce a result rather than get at a deeper analysis and to get at the truth.
Yes, I agree with that. When I first came to the US, it was like the first month. I have two anecdotes. Like the second day I was here, when I moved here until today, even though I moved around. So I am with a scholar who kind of like was accompanying me. I was like completely new, and there's a girl coming behind. So what do? Come from Argentina. I like open the door and hold it for her. And she screams at me, I can do it myself. I was just done. My friend, not my friend, he explained, it's because she's Black and you're white, whatever. Like, I don't know why she said that. And there was like this assertion. I'm like, I don't understand anything. And the second one happened to me in the supermarket. The same thing. Go buy a milk, leaking. Just tell the cashier, I'm gonna go back, get another one. Come back. There's a Black woman, and I don't cut in line. I had to pay. She starts screaming at me because I'm white and I was cutting in line. And I call that at the time the overdetermination of identity. Like, you see all of these things through this lens.
Right.
And I think that this is related to kind of the race card, right? You don't see the complexities or maybe the other motives, as you put it in your book. Maybe there are other motives in the situation that may explain what's going on, as opposed to, because we get caught in centrifugal, right? Like dynamics, just to put in people to the margins. So we have a last question. I could monopolize because, you know, I'm very passionate about these issues. So Douglas Canning asks, so much of political preference is about politicians who will preserve the culture in which I, the voter, I am most comfortable. So is it wrong for me to vote for or against candidates because they represent in their clothing, speech, etc., a culture different from mine? And if is not more generally an embrace of multiculturalism a threat to living comfortably in my, whoever I might be, culture?
Oh, how interesting. Is it wrong to vote against a candidate because they represent a culture different from mine? Well, I would say in a society that's as diverse and cosmopolitan as ours is, that is a mistake. Now, there's a big question to be asked first, though, what we mean by a candidate who has a culture different from mine. And I'm not sure what you mean by that, because typically, politicians in particular are all trying really hard to look pretty mainstream. There's a kind of standard political beltway uniform that most politicians wear. Now, when you get into local politics, maybe it's a little bit different. So I guess I do think that people in a cosmopolitan society should be open to difference. My worry about the multiculturalist project that we've been talking about is that we've constructed that difference in a really false and kind of stylized way. So you walk down the street and every day you see a bunch of people who look different, and they come from some different community, some different culture. I think we ought to be open to them. But I worry when we lay that onto race in a rigid way, that we've set up a kind of very stylized idea of what counts as cultural difference, that's not helpful and that's not accurate. And then you make presumptions that are mistaken. So it's interesting about the clothing, because in one sense, to use that metaphor again, clothing as a language, there's some people who are better with it than others, so they can convey what they want to convey, and then there's some people who don't try very hard, and then they're less competent. And then there are also some people who are better readers than others, and all of that is in the mix when we think about what am I getting out of a particular garment or expression. So for politics, the issue is we want to get to good policies, and we want to get to competent government. And what does what the person's wearing tell you about that? Now, I think it tells you something. I'm not going to say don't judge a book by its cover. That tells you nothing at all. It does tell you something, but what it tells you might be need some parsing out. It may not be obvious right away, and of course, you're also always being manipulated, because that's what politics is about. So everyone, when they it's never sincere in the political sphere. It's about 90 consultants told them what to wear. Except maybe for Trump's tie. He was going to wear that tie no matter how many people told him not to. But
you need to send me the link to that article, and I'm gonna
yes, I will.
Everybody. Yes, I'm glad you're making that point. I think it's an excellent point to finish, because it's okay. So I have one more question, if you would stay with us. Yeah. And I encourage people to sign up for the discussion session at 12. But I mean, it is the discussion about voting, about the crystallization of culture in a way, and the culture that someone represents. And you brought it beautifully to the point of we need to move from that which is kind of the sin that, with a very good intention, and these are my words, multiculturalists have fallen into, to a discussion of politics. Like, what are the policies? How do we address the structural issues? How do we put social justice again, right? Like real integration and employment and housing. You know, there's that kind of gap that we haven't, no pun intended, is not a plug-in for the brand or anything, but that gap that we need to, you know, from the cultural crystallization, you know, to the politics. I have two very quick questions. Comment on the use of cultural anxiety as a political weapon. And second, that's George Cohen and Regina Sneed. What's your take on the fascination with Bernie Sanders' dress for inauguration? Got so many tweets about
AOC.
Awesome.
Okay.
I retweeted.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So cultural anxiety. Yeah, I think that there's an idea that cultural difference in some sense has been constructed as a rhetorical tool to scare people. So, you know, I mean, a lot of the cultural anxiety you saw surrounding Trump was, you know, they're coming, they're flooding in through the borders, they're going to change our culture, they're going to destroy our culture. You know, who are they, and why are you sure that their culture is so different than yours? What is the nature of this anxiety really? And that cultural in that sense has just become a scarecrow. You know, it's also true with, you know, poor African Americans. Oh my God, you know, they've got this, you know, ghetto culture or something like that. But you actually look, they're not, you know, the cultural differences are less consequential than that. But there are socioeconomic issues, right? And this is really what's underlying some of it. And culture has become, you know, a way to a kind of an avoidance. With Bernie Sanders and AOC, yeah, it was really interesting that Bernie Sanders is, you know, I think Bernie Sanders cares a lot about what he wears. Actually, he looks kind of disheveled, and, you know, people think, well, he's the ultimate example of somebody who's that doesn't care about style and is all about substance, because look at how, but I think it's actually very carefully calibrated stylistic look that he has, which is to convey exactly that image that he's, you know, a down to earth, you know, socialist who doesn't care about glossy fashion and stuff like that. But, you know, he's the sweaters and the big mittens and all of that really are sending an image. It's quite good. AOC, interestingly enough, is, you know, in a sense, AOC's really sharp, fashionable look strikes me as much more sincere, if you will, than Bernie Sanders. You know, I mean, she's Latina from the Bronx, right? And or is it Brooklyn?
No, it's Queens, I think.
So you see, that's, I don't know New York. So, but she, you know, of course she wants to look fashionable. She's a young, you know, nice looking young woman. And she comes from a community where people, you know, look sharp and care about what they look like. And it would be shocking if she didn't. So for people then to say, well, oh, she says she's a socialist, but look, she's wearing Gucci or whatever. You know, well, she's got to look, she wants to look polished, but also, why shouldn't she look good? And so there I see it as maybe a bit less calculated. No, at the same time, of course, high heels, you know, she's short. So women in high heels, short women in high heels get some stature, and so much of what people react to are you know, really superficial things, like how tall the person is matters. So you can't blame her for wearing high heels. Anyway, I could talk a lot more about that.
No, but I would add something about AOC, because I thought about it. I think her style is like incredibly on point for the reasons that you stated, but also because, I mean, like women, we navigate very ambiguous messages about dressing to striking the right balance between how much you groom yourself and how much, you know, how superficial you are because you're grooming yourself too much and all sorts of things. So I think that with getting very sharp, she's walking the line between professionalism and femininity in the right balance.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
So the message gets through. She never retreats in her femininity, but neither in her substance, right? And professionalism. So it's right there in your face. I mean, you see her nails are perfect. How does she do? No glue.
So that's great. That's great. I agree. Absolutely.
Rich, this has been great.
Yes.
It's amazing to have you here. I encourage everyone to read your several books. If you send me a list or articles that you've written, I make sure that the audience gets them. I encourage all of you to sign up for the discussion session coming up soon. And I hope we can have you at the front, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. Such fabulous questions. So great. Well, thanks so much.
So goodbye, everyone. Next month, we have The Other Slavery by Andres Reséndez. I encourage you to sign up and to the discussion group. And now I give you Derek to close the session.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Professor Ford and Professor Kolesas. I did send out a reminder for the discussion session. Everybody should be getting that in their email, so click on it if you'd like to join us. And thank you to the staff for helping us with all the tech issues.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, ciao, ciao. See you at 12.